I'm Janice Trinidad, and in this video, I'm going to talk about some of my thinking around project calendars. The project planning form that I'm going to be discussing for most of this video can be found at this URL, bit.ly/TrinidadPPF. It's at the top up here. It is cap sensitive, but if you want to take a closer look at what I talk about after the video, you can go to that website. So for context, in this project, the standards I'm targeting in a roller coaster context deal with, in math, Pythagorean theorem, slope, y-intercept, y equals mx plus b equation. And in science, they deal with energy and motion. This is an integrated project where students were taking math with me in the morning and science with me in the afternoon. And throughout this project, they were learning these concepts through a context where there were roller coaster designers who were designing the roller coaster and using these standards to make sense of its performance and design. So in terms of a project calendar, some questions I want to focus on are, one, like how much time should we allot to a project? How can we divide up the project so it makes sense to students? And lastly, we'll kind of zoom in closer to daily agenda and think about how do you communicate goals to your students about what's in the project calendar and how that connects to their knows and need to knows. So for our first question, how much time can this project take? If we actually scroll down to the project calendar in this planning form, so I'm going to click there through the table of contents, you'll see I have a project that took us 1, 2, 3, 4, roughly 5 weeks and maybe a day extra. So I knew this project was going to take longer. I wasn't the first to facilitate this project because it has a build and analysis. So whenever you build something and gather data on it, it takes time. So when I look at some of my district resources, they give us a pacing guide that tells us roughly how long units should take. And they'll give us the freedom to rearrange that pacing guide so it maps onto our projects. One thing I notice if I'm thinking about roller coasters, this is going to be dealing with force and unit. This recommended pacing guide says 25 days, so that's about 5 weeks, which means if I'm going to integrate this with math, I need to see where I can pull those days. So if I look at my math recommended weeks, you'll see slope and y-intercept only take 8 days, which doesn't give us the 5 weeks we need. So in order to justify the time for this project, I had to integrate standards from the proportional and non-proportional functions unit, mainly proportional functions, and also out of the angle and triangle relationships unit, I had to pull out the Pythagorean standards from there so that way I could justify the time. So at our district, the way we make those decisions is I usually do this at the very beginning of the school year, late summer vacation, where I take something like this that has recommended pacings, and then I make this into a year to glance that maps onto projects with some wiggle days. They always give us 15 days for an applied unit, but since all of my units are done in the context of projects, I don't need those days, so that gives me some wiggle days. So at the beginning of the year, I will map those units and their days onto projects. So if you look at this list, each number is a week. This energy and motion unit is what took up the roller coaster. And in order to make it work, at least in math, you can see I had to incorporate 3 units of standards. So I'll make that clear ahead of time, knowing that this is about the amount of time it takes. So bottom line is, if you're gonna have, to know how much time it is, I would refer to the pacing guides and take about the time it takes. And if you know it's going to take longer, you know you're going to have to incorporate more standards into the project to justify the time. Because the last thing I want to do is get through a year and only get through half the curriculum because I did projects. I still want to teach a grade level course. The next thing is, once I know it's going to take that long and I know it's going to have all these standards, how do I break that up so it makes sense to me and to students so it's easy to communicate? So if you look at my project calendar, you'll see it has 3 phases, which I have in 3 colors. In phase 1 in my math class, which is this turquoise writing, we launched the project and we did a sequence of activities that focused on Pythagorean theorem. And then in the science, in that same project phase, we did a sequence of activities that connected to energy. In phase 2, which I've highlighted in green, in math, we dedicated phase 2 to slope, y-intercept, and linear equations. And then on the science side of things, by the time we got to green, we got to focus on motion, how to solve motion problems and motion graphs. And then finally, in the final phase, we did a lot of and preparation for testing and presentations. So in this final phase is practically like an all-encompassing review of the prior 2 phases, but the way we're doing that is through reviews. Also, we're pulling together all of the pieces they had done on the product, and then in these last sections, I'm giving team by team feedback on the product as a way to review all the material from the previous 2 phases, and also get them really prepared for their presentations. By the end of this last phase, I pretty much know what the grade on, most of the grade on the project is before they go to presentations, because I'm giving feedback all along this phase as they're creating product and pulling it together. And then the presentation, by the time they're invited to present, they know all of the concepts, and then I'll ask them more targeted questions to see if they can take their explanations up to advanced. So I highly recommend, if you have a longer project, break it up into phases. The next thing is then, how do I communicate the connections to knows and need to knows? I know in our scaffolding workshop, we say that our calendar should be connected to students' knows and need to know. So I'm going to show you some strategies around that. If you go to the bottom of this calendar, you'll see that there are links to my really detailed calendars. So if we go to one of those, you'll see I have the project calendar, but it's detailed in the sense that each of these days are live links that will go to the agenda for that day. So if I click on one of them, you'll see I have a standard template for each day. And on each day, the agenda includes the objectives and the need to knows that go with those objectives. So at the beginning of each class, I have a student class officer who's a facilitator, who will read out loud with emphasis this section of the agenda. So basically they'll go over what the need to knows are, what are the success criteria that go with those need to knows, and then they'll walk through the related activities and how to access them in our class website. And then they'll say what's coming up. So, and then the need to knows, I know we have a class list of need to knows, and to keep myself honest to their need to knows, I keep that link to the agenda, and every time I copy paste one of their need to knows to the agenda, I cross it off. And my goal by the end of the project is to make sure I answer all of their need to knows. So this project was already facilitated, so by the end of it, everything is crossed off. Another thing is then, how do I create the spacing and time for small group workshops? One way we came to this for this particular group of students is they really like ladders. So I'll show you a bit of what that looks like. If you look at my calendar, you'll see things that say something like slope, y-intercept, ladder 5, 4, 3, etc. So what I would do is for each project phase, we would create a ladder, which is a sequence of activities. And there would be a visual for that would look something like this. So the thing about these ladders is the names of the activities would always go in rainbow order. And then there would be a visual so that each day I can say, okay, by the end of today, try to make sure you get to this phase in the ladder. If you feel like you can move on, talk to me. So what I will do is I will have enough steps of the ladder prepared so that everyone can get started and maybe even get a little bit ahead. So that way students can make choices about whether they need to slow down at a part of the ladder, or if they feel comfortable, they can go forward. What that does for me is it allows student self-pacing to kind of naturally divide up the kids, so I don't have to meet with the whole class. I can meet, if the majority of the kids are on this part of the ladder, I can have a half class workshop on that phase. For those students that are ahead, I can go meet with those students and get them started on future activities. And for those that are running behind, I can meet with those students individually and discuss that. The students really liked being able to self-pace. In order to make that possible, I had to make a couple things available to them. One was something to get them started. So there would always be a workshop link associated with a step in the ladder, which would give them just enough information to get started. So it might be a few sample problems filled in, some notes. And then in order for them to know if they were ready to move on, somewhere in the class there would be a packet that matched the color of that ladder where they would find a key. And then they would compare their work to the key and self-stamp themselves. And then we'd have a conversation afterwards where I would check if they were truly ready to move on, and then I would give them the next activity. And then they liked this so much, and my students wanted me to be more effective at how I divide up my time among students at different paces. So some students voluntarily stayed after school and created these for all our team boxes. Basically, they're signs that indicate what part of the ladder they're on. And what students would do is, let's say there's a 3-person team, they could have several colors available on their team stand. And they knew if they were ahead to come find me. And then we came up with an agreement that at the beginning of class, I would prioritize the students that had the lower colors because they were running behind, and also give tips to the majority color. And then I would check in on the students that were running ahead. So again, it's the same type of activity that you would plan ahead. It's just chunked so that students can kind of get it in pieces and also have a sense of progress. And if you also have a mechanism for them to communicate to you where they are in that sequence, then you can start making decisions based on where they're at about where you should spend your time. I hope some of those tips gave you some things to help think about. If you want to look really carefully at the sequence, you can again go to this project planning form, and then after the calendar you can click through the agendas and look at the activities. Also, if you have any more questions, near the top of this form you can find my email. Hope that was helpful.